Hi, this is the second installation of China Today. In this particular lecture, I would like to focus on the US economy and eventually how the US economy might have impact on the Chinese foreign policy. First of all, we know that US dollars is now the world trading currency. In the eyes of the Chinese, this is a cost and risk because every time a country want to buy or sell some product to China, and the buyers had to convert it into US currency first and pay it to China, and China had to convert the US dollars back to renminbi to pay their workers. So this involves at least twice the cost of exchange, as well as the risk of the fluctuation of the exchange rates, the risk of exchange. The US currency is now under control of obviously under US government. We have seen examples whereby the US government, by shutting down the exchange of US dollars, then some sovereign states suffer economically through this so-called currency war. So using US dollars as a trading currency is vulnerable to be attacked through a currency war. So let's see how the US dollars eventually became the international trading and reserve currency. To that, we had to date back to 1944 during the Bretton Woods conference. Somehow the US convinced the then European nations to use US dollars as the trading currency. In exchange, US promised that every 35 US dollars, then taking that money into the Federal Reserve at the New York, they can exchange back to gold. So that was a gold-based currency. But unfortunately, there was no system of control how much money the US can print. So by 1971, people noticed that the US has been printing too much money, in particular, spending the money in the Vietnam War. So people is starting to take the money back to US and exchange of gold. For that, the then President Nixon issued an executive order 11615, saying that the US dollars is no longer exchangeable with gold. Basically stopped the gold-based US dollar currency from without consultation with the other members of the Bretton Woods system. Obviously, with that announcement, the US dollars dive, and so he has to find a way to shore it up. So what he did was that to send the then Secretary of State Kissinger to convince Saudi Arabia that they should sell their oil using US dollars. In exchange, then the US promised to export its arms and protect the Saudi Arabic family so that it will not be overthrown. So obviously, thereafter, the OPEC all agrees to use the US dollars as the currency to buy oil. What does it mean? Well, that means that because people need oil, so they need US dollars. Where do they get US dollars? They will send products to US in exchange of the US dollars. Now, the US can hence just print the money. By printing the money, then they get people selling their stuffs. So that is why the US has been in very prosperous since the petrodollars. What about those countries who refuse to use the US dollars to sell the oil? I have two examples here. Whether this is the real reason of U.S. attack, we can only suspect. We can't say for sure. But Saddam Hussein used euros, whereas Gaddafi want to use African dinar, which is again a gold-based currency, to sell their oil. So we know what has happened to both of these two men. So another interesting question is, of course, why the current actions on Russia? Why U.S. want to attack Russia? Well, one of the possible reasons is that Russia and China has agreed to sell the oil using their own currencies. So that might be one reason. Of course, we will never know for sure. So why is that a problem for China? Well, this is on the right. We see a graph showing the rise of the U.S. government's debt. The U.S. government debt at the moment is sitting at around 18 trillion. But in that debt, the U.S. government haven't taken into account the so-called unfunded liabilities. So what is unfunded liabilities? So suppose for a company, we know that the company need to pay a certain amount of money in, say, next 10 years. So it is wise to actually put aside some money so that by the time we have to pay the money, then we have the resource to pay it. So this is called liabilities. We, in a typical accounting method, funds has to be put aside. But at the moment, the U.S. government isn't putting aside any funding for liabilities, which are estimates from 80 trillion to 125 trillions. So what are these? These are the government pensions, the Medicare, and a lot of the government committed promises. So this is the amount estimated by different people. Let's say we take the lowest estimate, 80 trillion. Now look at the world GDP. The world GDP is around 75 trillion in 2013. So the US government owns more money than all the productivity of the whole world combined for 1 year without eating or sleeping or whatever. Another problem is that the US dollars and the US government bonds are reserves in different governments. That, according to IMF, that represents about 60% of the world's reserves. Well, if the US government spending their money wisely, or I will argue not. So an example is in 2015, Obama spent about 55% of his discretionary budget in defense. Okay, what is the discretionary budget? The U.S. government have a revenue of approximately $2 trillion per year. Out of that, about 1 trillion has a compulsory spending. So they are spent, the president can't say anything. For the rest, it is his discretionary budget. The discretionary budget covers the school, the education, the healthcare, the defense, and everything else. So given the current state of the U.S. infrastructure, spending over half of his discretionary money on defense, I don't think it's wise, but it is debatable. So let's look at what is money. Basically, money means a promise to pay. Now, for you and me, if I believe that the money I give you, if you believe that the money I'm giving you will be able to exchange from somebody else the same value as represented by the money, then it's okay. So it is a exchange for to help we trade. But from the issuer's point of view, if I print a US dollars and give it out, then basically I'm saying that later on when you take that dollar back to me, I will give you back a value of either service or resource. So US dollars is basically promised to pay. So are the debts. So the question is US government insolvent? Does it have the resources to pay its obligations? Now let's look at some of the history. What happens when the government's ability to pay is in question? So I'm quoting one example from 1921 to 1924. After the First World War, the then German owns quite a bit of money, and the victory countries demanded the money to be paid in gold. Obviously, during the First World War, the difference between the winning and the victory states and the losing state is how they funded the war. The German funded the war through government bonds, whereas the other countries funded the war through taxation. So when it wants to pay the gold, pay the war, whatever, then German finds it difficult to pay. So let's look at the number here. At the first half of 1921, $1 US is equal to 90 marks. And then by the end of that year, in November, $1 US is 330 marks. You will see that the depreciation is not by percentage, it is by factors. So the German mark loses value very quickly. And this is the graph showing the rate of hyperinflation. For gold, the same thing. We have to note that in this graph, the vertical axis is actually logarithmic. That means every one step is 10 times more. So in the then German, the price of gold rises very sharply. Here is the a more accurate data for the US government debts. The data come from 2013. So I'm not going to repeat again, but what we should be note is that if the interest rate is about 40%, then the whole US government revenue will have to be used to pay the interest. Of course, at the moment, the interest rate is set by the Federal Reserve, which has been deliberately set it down to very low. So at the moment, that is not a concern. But if somehow the US government find it difficult to borrow money, then the interest rate will go up. And when the interest rate go up, then the government default might happen. At the moment, we're not seeing that, so that's okay. Can government actually default? Yes, the government do default. A full list of that, or at least a partial list of that, can be found in Wikipedia. From the U.S. history themselves, during the Civil War, the United States repudiated the debts of the federal states of America. So yes, it happened. So let's recap a little bit of the problem facing China at the moment. First of all, China's seaboard is surrounded by U.S. military bases. The Chinese have too much U.S. government bonds. Its sea route is under U.S. control, and unfortunately, U.S. views China as a potential enemy. So, at the same time, the Chinese also face its own domestic problems. The GDP growth in 2014, that's last year, is 7.4%. It's the lowest in the past 24 years. The infrastructure projects enter a new phase. About half of the highway has been built, and most of the main high-speed rail lines has been built, so there will be excess capacity. Of course, we know that China has a huge environmental problems, basically due to the coal-fired the power plants and the industrializations. China is now the world's largest importer of energy, and of course there are income inequalities. So China internally also faces a lot of problem. So again, I'm asking the same question: if you were the Chinese leader, what would you do? So we will go over that in the later lectures. Thank you. Bye bye.